Unit 1, Basic Economic Concepts. Part 1.1, Scarcity. Let's start at the very beginning, not just of this course, but of economics itself. Before we talk about supply and demand, before we get into GDP or inflation or monetary policy, we need to understand the one idea that makes economics necessary in the first place. That idea is scarcity. And here's the thing, scarcity isn't just some abstract textbook concept. It's the reason you've ever had to make a decision. Any decision. Ever. What scarcity really means, here's how I want you to think about it. Imagine you're at a pizza buffet, your absolute favorite place, but you only have 20 minutes before you have to leave. There are 12 different kinds of pizza. You cannot eat all 12. You have unlimited wants, you want all 12, but you have a very limited resource, time, and maybe stomach space. That tension right there, that's scarcity. Scarcity exists because human wants are essentially unlimited, but the resources we use to satisfy those wants, time, money, land, labor, raw materials, are fundamentally limited. The formal definition you need locked in for the AP exam is this. Scarcity is the condition that exists because resources are limited while human wants are unlimited. Notice what scarcity is not. It's not the same as something being rare or expensive. Water is not scarce because it's rare. Water covers most of the planet, but fresh, drinkable, accessible water is scarce because the want for it outstrips the easily available supply in many parts of the world. Scarcity is about that gap between unlimited wants and limited means. Keep that distinction sharp. Resources and the factors of production. Now, when economists talk about the limited resources we use to produce things, they organize them into 4 categories called the factors of production. A great mnemonic to remember them is CEL: capital, entrepreneurship, land, and labor. Land covers all natural resources, not just soil, but oil, timber, water, minerals, everything pulled from the natural world. Labor is the human effort, both physical and mental, that goes into producing goods and services. Capital. And this is a classic AP trap, so pay attention. Capital in economics does not mean money. Capital means physical capital, the tools, machinery, factories, and equipment used to produce other things. The money you use to buy a factory is financial capital, but the factory itself is economic capital. Students mix this up constantly on the exam, so burn that distinction into your brain. And finally, entrepreneurship is the human ability to combine land, labor, and capital in new ways, take on the risk of starting a business, and drive innovation forward. Every single thing ever produced in human history, every phone, every sandwich, every concert, every medical procedure required some combination of these 4 factors. And because all 4 are limited, everything we produce involves trade-offs. Why scarcity forces choice? This is where scarcity gets really interesting, because scarcity doesn't just mean there isn't enough stuff. It means that every choice you make comes at a cost, specifically what economists call an opportunity cost. We'll dig much deeper into opportunity cost in the next section, but for now, understand this. The moment scarcity exists, choosing one thing always means giving up something else. You can't escape it. If a government spends its budget on building roads, those same dollars can't go to schools. If you spend Saturday afternoons studying, you're giving up whatever else you could have done with that time. Scarcity is the reason every decision has a cost beyond just the price tag. One thing the AP exam loves to test is whether you understand that scarcity applies to all economic agents, individuals, businesses, and governments alike. Even the wealthiest government on earth faces scarcity. The United States cannot fund every possible program, fight every possible problem, and cut every possible tax simultaneously. Resources are always limited relative to the unlimited range of things we'd like to do with them. That universality of scarcity is fundamental. The 3 basic economic questions. Because of scarcity, every society, from a tiny village to a global superpower, must answer 3 fundamental questions. What to produce? You can't make everything, so what gets made? How to produce it? Which combination of resources and methods do you use? For whom to produce it? Who gets the goods and services that are created? These 3 questions are the foundation upon which every economic system, whether it's a free market, a command economy, or something in between, is built. Different societies answer these questions differently, and that's what gives rise to different economic systems. But every society has to answer them, because every society faces scarcity. A helpful way to remember these for the exam. Think of the 3 questions as what, how, and who, the WHW framework. Anytime you see a question about why economies must make choices or what the fundamental economic problem is, You trace it all back to scarcity and the WHW questions it forces us to answer. AP exam pitfalls to watch. Two quick traps before we move on. First, don't confuse scarcity with shortage. A shortage is a temporary market condition where quantity demanded exceeds quantity supplied at a given price. It can be fixed by raising the price. Scarcity is a permanent, universal condition of human existence. Second, remember that free goods, things like sunlight or open-air wind, are not scarce in the economic sense because they're available in quantities that exceed human wants for them. Almost everything else, though, scarce. With scarcity as our foundation, this bedrock idea that limited resources and unlimited wants force every person and every society to make choices, we're perfectly set up to explore one of the most powerful tools economists use to visualize those choices, the production possibilities curve. Part 1.2 Opportunity Cost and the Production Possibilities Curve, PPC. All right, let's talk about two of the most foundational ideas in all of economics, opportunity cost and the production possibilities curve. These concepts show up everywhere on the AP exam, and more importantly, they show up everywhere in real life. Once you truly understand opportunity cost, you will never make a decision the same way again. I mean that. Let's dig in. Opportunity cost, the road not taken. Here's the core idea. Every choice you make comes with a hidden price tag. Not a price you pay in dollars, but a price you pay in foregone alternatives. Opportunity cost is the value of the next best alternative you give up when you make a choice. Notice that word, next best. Not every alternative you gave up, just the single best one you didn't choose. Think about it this way. Imagine it's a Saturday morning and you have 3 hours to spare. You could sleep in, study for your AP exam, or hang out with friends. You decide to study. What's your opportunity cost? It's whichever of those remaining options you valued most, let's say sleeping in. That lost sleep is your opportunity cost, not both sleeping and socializing combined, just the top alternative you sacrificed. This is where students trip up on the AP exam all the time. Opportunity cost is singular. It's the one best forgone option, not the sum of everything else you could have done. Keep that sharp in your mind. Now here's something even more subtle. Opportunity cost is not always monetary. If a doctor decides to spend an afternoon volunteering at a free clinic instead of seeing patients, the opportunity cost isn't just her lost afternoon, it's the income she would have earned seeing patients. Economists always ask, what did you give up? And the answer is always the next best use of that time, money, or resource. The production possibilities curve, a country's menu of choices. Now, let's scale this up from individuals to entire economies. Imagine a country that can only produce two things. Let's say robots and pizza. Delightful combination, I know. The production possibilities curve, or PPC, is a graph that shows every possible combination of those two goods that an economy can produce when it's using all of its resources fully and efficiently. Think of it as the economy's menu. It shows what's possible, but choosing more of one item means getting less of another. On the graph, you put one good on each axis. Any point sitting directly on the curve represents full efficiency. The economy is humming along, nothing is being wasted. Any point inside the curve closer to the origin represents inefficiency. You're producing less than you could be, perhaps because workers are unemployed or factories are sitting idle, and any point outside the curve, that's currently impossible given the economy's existing resources and technology. It's beyond reach for now. Here's the beautiful thing about the PPC. It makes opportunity cost visible. When you move along the curve to produce more robots, you have to produce fewer pizzas. That sacrifice in pizza is your opportunity cost, and you can literally see it on the graph. The slope of the PPC at any given point tells you the opportunity cost of producing one more unit of one good in terms of the other. Concave shape and the law of increasing opportunity cost. Now, pay close attention here because this is a major AP exam concept. The PPC is typically drawn as a bowed-out concave curve, not a straight line. Why? Because of something called the law of increasing opportunity cost. Here's the intuition. Not all resources are equally suited to producing every good. Imagine you're shifting workers from pizza making to robot building. At first, you move workers who were only marginally good at making pizza, but who turn out to be excellent at building robots. Great trade-off. But as you keep shifting more and more workers into robot production, you eventually have to pull away your best pizza chefs, people who are terrible at building robots. Now you're giving up a lot of pizza for very few additional robots. The opportunity cost of each additional robot keeps rising. That's the law of increasing opportunity cost, and it's the reason the PPC bows outward like a frown. The one exception to watch for: if a PPC is drawn as a straight line, that means constant opportunity cost. Every unit of one good sacrificed yields the same amount of the other. This happens when resources are perfectly interchangeable between two goods, which is rare but worth recognizing on the exam. Shifts in the PPC: growth and decline. Here's where things get dynamic. The PPC doesn't just sit still, it can shift. If an economy experiences economic growth, better technology, more workers, an increase in capital, the entire curve shifts outward. More of both goods becomes possible. This is what economists mean when they talk about long-run economic growth. On the flip side, a disaster, war, or loss of resources can shift the curve inward, a grim but testable scenario. And here's a nuance you should know cold. Improvements in technology for producing only one good will shift the PPC outward, but only on one end, pivoting the curve rather than moving the whole thing uniformly. A quick mnemonic to hold all of this together: think IPE, points inside mean inefficiency, points on the curve mean productive efficiency, and points external to the curve are currently impossible but reachable through economic growth. PIPE, leak-proof understanding. The AP exam loves asking you to interpret PPC graphs, calculate opportunity costs from tables, and identify what causes shifts. Practice reading those graphs until they feel like second nature. Your future self will thank you. With opportunity cost and the PPC firmly in your toolkit, you're ready to explore how these ideas apply to trade between nations, which is exactly where we're headed next, as we look at comparative advantage and the gains from specialization. Part 1.3: Comparative Advantage and Gains from Trade. All right, let's talk about one of the most powerful and counterintuitive ideas in all of economics, an idea so elegant that when it was formalized in the early 1800s, it basically rewrote how nations think about trade. We're talking about comparative advantage, and once you truly get it, you'll never look at international trade, or even your own daily choices, the same way again. Absolute versus comparative advantage. Let's start with a story. Imagine you and your friend Jordan are both studying for finals. You can write a history essay in 2 hours and solve a math problem set in 1 hour. Jordan takes 4 hours on the history essay and 3 hours on the math. You are faster at both tasks. In economics, we say you have an absolute advantage in both, meaning you can produce more output with the same resources or use fewer resources to produce the same output. Now, here's where most people stop thinking. But economics says, wait, there's more. Even though you're better at everything, should you really do everything? That's where comparative advantage comes in. Comparative advantage is about opportunity cost, what you give up to produce one more unit of something. You have a comparative advantage in a good when you can produce it at a lower opportunity cost than someone else. That's the definition you need locked in for the AP exam. Here's how we find it in our example. To do 1 hour of math, you give up 1 hour of history writing, so your opportunity cost of math is half a history essay. Jordan, spending 3 hours on math, gives up 3/4 of a history essay. Your opportunity cost of math is actually lower than Jordan's, so you have the comparative advantage in math. Flip it around. Jordan's opportunity cost of writing history is lower than yours, so Jordan has the comparative advantage there. Even though you're faster at both, it still makes sense for you to handle math and Jordan to handle history, and both of you end up better off. That is the magic. Calculating opportunity cost from a production possibilities table. On the AP exam, you will almost certainly see a table showing 2 countries or 2 people producing 2 goods. Your job is to calculate opportunity costs and identify who has the comparative advantage in each good. Here's the method. Look at one producer's row. If country A can produce either 40 units of wheat or 20 units of cloth, then the opportunity cost of 1 unit of wheat is half a unit of cloth, 20 divided by 40. And the opportunity cost of 1 unit of cloth is 2 units of wheat, 40 divided by 20. Do the same for country B, then compare. Whoever has the lower opportunity cost for a given good holds the comparative advantage in that good. And here's a rule you can take to the bank. Comparative advantage is always a two-way street. If country A has the comparative advantage in wheat, country B automatically has the comparative advantage in cloth. It is logically impossible for one country to have the comparative advantage in everything. A common AP pitfall? Confusing absolute and comparative advantage. A country can have the absolute advantage in both goods and still not have the comparative advantage in both. Keep those concepts cleanly separated in your mind. Gains from trade and the terms of trade. So why does any of this matter? Because comparative advantage is the economic engine behind gains from trade, the idea that when individuals, firms, or nations specialize in trade, everyone can consume beyond what they could produce alone. Think of it like this. Instead of every person growing their own food, building their own house, and sewing their own clothes, we each specialize in what we're relatively best at in trade. The result is a world with more total output and higher living standards for everyone involved. Specialization based on comparative advantage is literally why economies exist as something more than isolated, self-sufficient farms. Now, for trade to actually happen, both parties need to benefit, and that's where the terms of trade come in. The terms of trade describe the rate at which one good is exchanged for another. For both countries to gain from trade, the terms of trade must fall between the two countries' opportunity costs. If country A's opportunity cost of wheat is half a unit of cloth and country B's is 2 units of cloth, then any exchange rate between 1/2 and 2 units of cloth per unit of wheat makes both countries willing to trade. Outside that range, at least one country would rather just produce the good itself. A helpful mnemonic: think between the bests. The terms of trade have to fall between each country's own opportunity cost, or the deal doesn't get made. What the AP exam really tests. Beyond the calculations, the AP exam loves to test whether you understand the logic behind specialization. A country should export the good in which it has the comparative advantage and import the good in which it does not. That's the whole trade strategy right there in one sentence. The exam may also ask you whether a proposed terms of trade ratio is mutually beneficial. Just check whether it falls between the two opportunity costs. One more thing to remember. Comparative advantage is about relative efficiency, not absolute performance. A country that is less productive across the board can still gain enormously from trade by focusing on what it does least badly compared to everything else. With comparative advantage under your belt, you now have the theoretical foundation for why economies don't try to produce everything themselves. Coming up next, we'll look at how economists model an economy's production choices visually through the production possibilities curve, and you'll see how the concept of opportunity cost comes to life on a graph. Part 1.4: Demand. All right, let's talk about demand. And I mean, really talk about it, because this is one of those foundational concepts that shows up everywhere on the AP exam. If you can master demand now, you're building the bedrock that everything else in macroeconomics rests on. So grab your coffee, get comfortable, and let's dig in. What is demand, really? Here's where most students make their first mistake. They confuse want with demand. I want a private jet. But that desire alone doesn't constitute demand in the economic sense. Demand is the relationship between the price of a good and the quantity of that good consumers are willing and able to purchase over a given period of time. Notice those two words, willing and able. You need both. The willingness is the desire, but the ability is the purchasing power to back it up. No purchasing power, no demand. Keep that distinction sharp, because the AP exam loves to test it. The law of demand. Now, the cornerstone of this whole section is the law of demand, and it states this: all else being equal. And that phrase, all else being equal, is called ceteris paribus, which you'll want to know as the price of a good rises, the quantity demanded falls. And as price falls, quantity demanded rises. Price and quantity demanded move in opposite directions. Always think about it with your morning coffee. If your favorite cafe suddenly charges $12 for a latte, you might start brewing at home. But if they drop the price to $1, you're probably buying too. That inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded is the law of demand in action, and it's why the demand curve slopes downward from left to right on a graph. Speaking of the graph, picture a standard coordinate plane. Price goes on the vertical axis, quantity goes on the horizontal axis. The demand curve, labeled D, sweeps down from the upper left toward the lower right. Every point on that curve represents a price-quantity combination that consumers would choose. Burn that image into your memory, because you will be drawing it on the AP exam. Shifts in demand versus movement along the demand curve. Here is the single most important distinction in this entire section, and I cannot stress this enough. There is a massive difference between a change in quantity demanded and a change in demand. This trips up students every single year. A change in quantity demanded is a movement along the existing demand curve. It happens when and only when the price of the good itself changes. The curve doesn't move, you're just sliding up or down it. A change in demand, on the other hand, is a shift of the entire curve. The whole line moves left or right. And this happens because of what we call the determinants of demand, or the non-price factors. A helpful way to remember these is the acronym TRIB, tastes and preferences, are related goods prices. income, B, buyers in the market, and E, expectations about the future. Let's walk through each one quickly. If consumer tastes shift, say a new study comes out showing that dark chocolate prevents aging, demand for dark chocolate increases, and the curve shifts right. If a related good's price changes, you need to think about whether it's a substitute or a complement. Substitutes are goods that can replace each other, like Pepsi and Coke. If Coke's price rises, demand for Pepsi increases, curve shifts, right? Complements are goods used together, like coffee and cream. If coffee becomes expensive and people buy less of it, demand for cream falls. That curve shifts left. Income matters too. But here you need to know about normal goods versus inferior goods. For normal goods, think vacations, new cars, fresh produce. When your income rises, your demand rises. Curve shifts right. For inferior goods, think instant noodles or used cars. When your income rises, your demand actually falls because you upgrade to better alternatives. More buyers in the market naturally increases demand. And if people expect prices to rise in the future, they buy more today, increasing current demand. Reading the curve and AP exam pitfalls. When the demand curve shifts right, that means demand has increased at every price level. Consumers want more. When it shifts left, demand has decreased. A rightward shift is good news for sellers. A leftward shift, not so much. One of the most common AP exam pitfalls is saying that demand increased when prices changed. No, that's just a movement along the curve. Demand itself only changes when one of those tribe factors changes. If you write demand increased because price fell, you will lose points. Price changes cause movement, everything else causes shifts. Another classic pitfall, mixing up the demand curve with the demand schedule. The schedule is just a table showing different price-quantity combinations. It's the same information, just in table form rather than graph form. Both represent the same relationship. Putting it all together. So here's your mental checklist when you see a demand question on the AP exam. First, ask yourself, did the price of this good change? If yes, it's a movement along the curve. Quantity demanded change, but demand itself did not. If something else changed, income, tastes, related goods, number of buyers, expectations, then demand itself shifted and the whole curve moves. Demand is your foundation. And once you've got it locked in, you're ready to build the next wall, supply. Because demand never operates in isolation. It's always in conversation with supply. And that's exactly where we're headed next. Part 1.5, Supply. Now that we've talked about demand, what buyers want and how much they're willing to pay, it's time to flip to the other side of the market and talk about supply. Supply is the producer's side of the story, and just like demand had its own logic, supply has a beautiful internal consistency that, once you see it, you'll never forget. So grab your coffee, because we're about to build this concept from the ground up. The law of supply. Let's start with the fundamental principle. The law of supply. It states that as the price of a good increases, the quantity supplied increases, and as price falls, quantity supplied falls. In other words, price and quantity supplied move in the same direction. This gives us a supply curve that slopes upward, which is the opposite of demand's downward slope. Why does this make sense? Think about it from a producer's perspective. Imagine you run a lemonade stand. If someone tells you they'll pay 50 cents a cup, you might squeeze a dozen lemons a day. But if they'll pay $5 a cup, suddenly you're recruiting your little sister, borrowing your neighbor's juicer, and running to the grocery store for more lemons. Higher prices mean higher potential profit, so producers are motivated to produce more. It's really that straightforward. The quantity supplied, notice that phrase, quantity supplied, refers to a specific amount at a specific price. When price changes, you move along the existing supply curve. You do not draw a new curve. This is one of the most common mistakes students make on the AP exam. So tattoo it on your brain. A change in price causes a movement along the supply curve, not a shift of the curve itself. Shifts in supply. So what does cause the supply curve to shift? A shift means the entire curve moves. Producers are willing to supply more or less at every price level. There are 6 major determinants of supply, and a great way to remember them is the acronym ROTTEN. ROTTEN are resource prices, other goods prices, technology, taxes and subsidies, expectations, and a number of sellers. Let's walk through each one. Resource prices, also called input costs, are the costs of making your product. If the price of steel goes up, car manufacturers face higher costs and will produce fewer cars at every price level. The supply curve shifts left, meaning supply decreases. On the flip side, if wages fall or raw materials get cheaper, supply increases and the curve shifts right. Technology improvements are a beautiful thing for producers. When a new, more efficient machine cuts your production costs in half, you can produce more at every price. That shifts the supply curve to the right. Think about how advances in farming technology have dramatically increased food production over the last century without prices going through the roof. Taxes and subsidies work in opposite directions. A tax on production acts like an increase in costs. It shifts supply left. A government subsidy, like money given to farmers or solar panel manufacturers, lowers effective costs and shifts supply, right? Expectations matter too. If producers expect prices to rise in the future, they might hold back some of their current supply, waiting for that better price, which decreases supply today. And finally, the number of sellers is almost intuitive. More producers in a market means more total supply, shifting the curve right, while producers leaving the market shifts it left. Reading the supply graph. On your AP exam, you need to be completely comfortable drawing and interpreting a supply graph. The horizontal axis is always quantity, the vertical axis is always price, and the supply curve slopes upward from left to right. When supply increases, the curve shifts to the right, meaning producers offer more at every price. When supply decreases, the curve shifts to the left. Here's a trick to keep the direction straight. Think of a rightward shift as more supply at every price, and a leftward shift as less. When you see a question asking what happens to supply when, say, a hurricane destroys oil refineries, you should immediately think higher input costs, less supply, curve shifts left. Practice this pattern until it becomes second nature. Individual versus market supply. One more distinction worth noting. Just as we differentiated between individual demand and market demand, we do the same with supply. Individual supply is what a single producer is willing and able to offer. Market supply is the horizontal summation of all individual suppliers in the market. More firms entering the market increases market supply. Again, shift right. Common AP exam pitfalls. The exam loves to test whether you can distinguish between a change in quantity supplied and a change in supply itself. Remember, only a price change moves you along the curve. Everything else, input costs, technology, taxes, expectations, number of sellers, shifts the whole curve. If you can keep that distinction sharp under pressure, you'll avoid one of the most heavily tested traps in this entire unit. Also, watch out for questions about subsidies versus taxes. Students sometimes mix up which direction each one shifts the curve. Just remind yourself, a subsidy is a gift to producers, so it helps them produce more. Shift right. A tax is a burden, so it reduces supply. Shift left. Now that you have a solid grip on supply on its own, it's time to bring both sides of the market together, because the real magic happens when supply and demand meet, which is exactly what we'll explore in our next section on market equilibrium. Part 1.6: Market Equilibrium, Disequilibrium, and Changes in Equilibrium. All right, so you've learned about supply and demand separately. Now it's time to bring them together and watch the magic happen. This is where markets actually do something. This section is absolutely central to the AP exam, so pay close attention, because you're going to see equilibrium concepts show up again and again, not just in Unit 1, but all the way through Unit 5. Think of everything you've learned so far as two puzzle pieces. Equilibrium is the moment that they click together. What is market equilibrium? Let's start with a simple image. Imagine a seesaw on a perfectly calm playground, both sides balanced, neither side touching the ground. That's equilibrium. In economics, market equilibrium is the point where the quantity demanded by buyers exactly equals the quantity supplied by sellers. At this price, called the equilibrium price, or sometimes the market clearing price, there's no leftover product sitting on shelves and no frustrated customers walking away empty-handed. Everything that's brought to market gets sold, and everyone willing to pay that price gets what they want. On your supply and demand graph, this is the point where the two curves intersect. The price at that intersection is your equilibrium price, and the quantity at that intersection is your equilibrium quantity. Burn that image into your brain, because the AP exam loves to test whether you can identify what happens to both of those values when something in the market changes. Disequilibrium, surpluses and shortages. Now, markets aren't always in that perfect balanced state, and this is where disequilibrium comes in. Disequilibrium simply means the market is not at equilibrium. There are two flavors, surplus and shortage, and mixing them up is one of the most common mistakes students make on the exam, so let's be very precise here. A surplus, also called excess supply, happens when the price is above equilibrium. Picture a farmer who decides to charge $5 for a dozen eggs when the market equilibrium is $3. At $5, a lot of farmers want to supply eggs, but buyers aren't so enthusiastic. You end up with more eggs supplied than demanded. Shelves are full, nobody's buying, and eventually that farmer has to lower the price. That's the self-correcting magic of markets. A surplus puts downward pressure on price, pushing it back toward equilibrium. A shortage, also called excess demand, is the mirror image. When the price is below equilibrium, quantity demanded exceeds quantity supplied. Think about concert tickets priced too low. Everyone wants them, but there aren't enough to go around. Lines form, people go without, and sellers realize they could charge more. A shortage puts upward pressure on price, again nudging the market back toward equilibrium. The key insight here, and the AP exam tests this directly, is that in a free market, prices are self-regulating. They move on their own toward equilibrium, like water finding its level. Changes in equilibrium, shifting the curves. Here's where it gets really interesting, and honestly, where most of the AP exam points live. What happens to equilibrium when something outside the market changes? When the supply or demand curve shifts, your equilibrium price and quantity both change, and you need to be able to predict exactly how. Let's walk through the logic. Suppose consumer incomes rise and your product is a normal good, say restaurant meals. Higher incomes mean more demand at every price, so the demand curve shifts to the right. On your graph, the new intersection point is up and to the right of the old one. Result, both equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity increase. Made sense, right? More demand, prices go up, and more get sold. Now flip it. Suppose a new technology makes it much cheaper to produce smartphones. That's a supply shifter. It increases supply, shifting the curve to the right. The new intersection is down and to the right. Equilibrium price falls, but equilibrium quantity rises. This is why televisions and computers have gotten dramatically cheaper over the decades, even as we buy more of them than ever. The trickiest scenarios on the AP exam involve both curves shifting at the same time. Here's your rule of thumb. When both supply and demand shift, one of your two outcomes, price or quantity, will be certain, and the other will be ambiguous depending on the relative size of the shifts. For example, if demand increases and supply decreases simultaneously, you know for certain that price will rise, but whether quantity rises or falls depends on which shift is bigger. The AP exam loves to throw these double shift questions at you, so practice them until they feel automatic. A mnemonic that helps students keep the outcomes straight. Think PQ. When one curve shifts, you always get a clear answer for both price and quantity. When two curves shift in opposite directions on the same variable, one answer becomes a question mark. Anytime you see two curves moving, ask yourself, what's certain and what's ambiguous? One last pitfall to avoid. Don't confuse a shift in a curve with a movement along a curve. A change in price causes you to move along the existing supply or demand curve. A change in any other determinant, income, tastes, input costs, expectations, number of buyers or sellers, causes the whole curve to shift. This distinction trips up a surprising number of test takers every year. With equilibrium firmly in your toolkit, you're ready to step into one of the most powerful applications in all of macroeconomics. Understanding how these same principles of supply, demand, and price signals operate at the scale of entire national economies, which is exactly where we're